Hey everybody, this is chapter 8 of Karl Korsch, A Study in Western Marxism by Patrick Goode. Chapter 8 is titled Beyond Marxism. I'm going to look at the endnotes first. You might find this annoying, but to hell with you. Yeah. Some of the works cited. F. Neumann et al., The Cultural Migration, published in 1953. L. Thermy's book, Illustrious Immigrants, 1968. Paul Lazarsfeld, A Memoir, in D. Fleming and B. Balin's edited volume, The Intellectual Migration, Europe and America, 1930 to 1960. It says, thus he was lecturer at the State College of Washington, Pullman, Washington, for the spring term of 1942, visiting assistant professor at Tulane University in Louisiana, New Orleans. His lectures at Seattle in connection with military training programs are in the IISG-MSS. See the articles Collapse of Germany, Pattern of Collapse, Germany after the Armistice of 1918, all published in 1943, and the article Germany Today, published in 1944. See Korsch and Lewin's article Mathematical Constructs in Psychology and Sociology, published in the Journal of Unified Science, 1939. Lewin's book Die Sozialisierung des Taylor-Systems had appeared in Korsch's series Praktischer Sozialismus. C.J., The Dialectical Imagination. See Korsch's article Revolution for What? A Critical Comment on John Vatlin's book Out of the Night, published in Living Marxism, 1941. See Korsch's Prelude to Hitler, Living Marxism, 1940. Karl Korsch, The Fascist Counter-Revolution, published in Living Marxism in 1940. See Korsch's article The Structure and Practice of Totalitarianism, published in 1942, and New Essays, which is Paul Maddox's journal, if you don't remember that. Let's see. See Korsch's The Fight for Britain, The Fight for Democracy, and the War Aims of the Working Class, published in Living Marxism, 1941. See Korsch's article Human Nature, the Review of Human Nature, the Marxian View by Vernon Venable, published in the Journal of Philosophy. See Korsch's article The World Historians from Turgot to Toynbee, published in Partisan Review, 1942. See Rozdalsky's The Making of Marx's Capital. See G.E. Rusconi's article Introduction to the Piece What is Socialization by Korsch, published in New German Critique in 1975. See Trotsky, The Platform of the Left Opposition, 1927. See Korsch's article Marxism and the Present Task of the Proletarian Class Struggle, published with Living Marxism, 1938. See Korsch's article A Non-Dogmatic Approach to Marxism, originally published in Politics, 1946. And Lenin's piece, What is to be Done, collected works. Okay, so that's the end of the endnotes. The previous chapter ended with the publication of Karl Marx, the book Karl Marx, in 1938. This was to be Korsch's last major work, although until 1946 he continued to write a certain number of articles each year, but no more books. Thereafter, Korsch published very little, his last article appearing in 1954, 7 years before his death. This whole period covers 23 years, longer than that between the pamphlet What is Socialization, 1919, and the book Karl Marx of 1938, yet to deal with it fully requires a much shorter chapter than any previous one. Why was this period so barren? There are, I feel, two main reasons for this: the difficulties Korsch encountered in emigration, and the lack of an influential Marxist movement during his years in the USA. I shall deal with these factors before examining his writings of this period. Owing to a combination of circumstances, political intrigue against him by the Communist Party, and an incident involving another refugee being contributory factors, he had been unable to get a residence permit for England. In any case, the opportunities in England for the refugee scholars who began to stream out of Germany in 1933 were strictly limited, so that in 1936 Korsch finally decided to move to the United States of America. Conditions for emigres were not much easier there because in the late 1930s America was suffering from the effects of the Depression. This was still being felt by the colleges and universities, which were forced to make cuts in their expenditure, resulting in unemployment even for American academics. Thus, it was estimated that in 1933, 5,000 American PhDs, many of whom would in the normal course of things have gone into academic life, were still unemployed. The problem was further complicated by the fact that in the German emigration, quite a high proportion belonged to the academic professions. Further, as Lassersfeld had pointed out, the foreign intellectual was, by comparison to today, comparatively rare in America in the 1930s. Up to 1945, Korsch applied for a number of university posts, but did not get a permanent appointment. He held appointments for an occasional semester and a visiting assistant professorship at an obscure university in the South, but this is all. During the war, he gave occasional lectures on Germany in connection with military training programs, but this did not lead to a more permanent position. He also applied to the Guggenheim Foundation for support for a project on the sociology of speech and thought. This was to develop an idea first put forward in his Thesen über Ökonomie und Politik, one of the first drafts for the book Karl Marx. The quote, "Every language and every successive form of language is at first a necessary instrument of thought and action, a form for the development of thought, which only changes into a restriction on thought in its recorded form, which is inevitable." End quote. Korsch. Korsch also appeared at two academic congresses, a sociologist congress in Detroit in 1938 and the Fifth International Congress of the Unity of Science at Cambridge, Massachusetts, in which he gave a paper on mathematical constructs, gave a paper titled Mathematical Constructs in Psychology and Sociology. He had worked on this paper with his old friend Kurt Lewin. This too was of no avail in getting him a post. The main lifeline for exiled Marxists or Marxistants was the Institute for Sozialforschung, which had moved to New York City in 1934 to become the International Institute for Social Research. Due to the continued generosity of Hermann Weyl and of a timely transfer of its funds, the Institute was relatively well off. But as I have already noted, although Korsch had earlier written some articles for its journal, the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, Korsch and the Institute had little sympathy for each other. Apparently, Korsch did participate in some of its seminars, but he was never offered a full membership. As late as the Institute's 1944 unpublished history, titled 10 Years on Morningside Heights, Korsch was listed as a, quote, fellow, but this seems to have meant little. Besides being unable to find employment or financial support, although the financial problem was relieved by his wife's finding a job teaching German at a college near Boston, Korsch was further isolated because he seemed to have found great difficulties in making the necessary cultural adjustments. Although he did not publish anything about his experiences in the USA, he made some very revealing comments in a letter to Paul Partos in 1939. He found that America was really quite different from the, quote, old Europe, in which he had lived, worked, and fought. Even after 2.5 years in increasing measure, he said, it, quote, seems to the European that everything is too large, too broad, too incoherent, too difficult to have an overall view of, so that it is impossible to take a uniform position on it, end quote. Korsch. Korsch summed up his feelings in a classic, if somewhat Teutonic verdict of the emigre. Quote, the individual feels that he is tiny, powerless, ignorant, in the face of the breadth, variety, and changeability of general existence and events, end quote. Korsch. Even in 1956, after almost 20 years in his land of exile, he could write of, quote, my desolation, Vusta, in the U.S., end quote. Korsch seemed to find it difficult to apply to American society the traditional categories derived from the European experience. In the European sense, there is neither a state nor a definite arrangement of society according to interests, classes, or relevant ideas to be found in America. Korsch. This lack of an orientation relates to the second reason for the difficulties in his years in America. That the political scene was very different and confusing for a European, particularly a Marxist. Although the Depression years were times of widespread unemployment and mass poverty, the American working class seemed to make little positive response. There was not even a reformist socialist party on the lines of the English Labour Party, let alone a large Marxist party such as the SPD or the KPD in Germany. The group Korsch felt closest to was the, quote, Council Communist Group founded in 1935 by Paul Maddock. As its founder admitted, this could not be regarded as a party, only as a propaganda organization advocating self-rule by the working class. Korsch's work with this group was the main political activity he carried out in emigration. What was its character? Maddock later described the politics of the group as follows, quote, the group was equally far removed from the traditional Socialist Party, the new Communist Party, and the various, quote, opposition parties that these movements brought forth. It rejected the ideologies and organization concepts of the Second and Third Internationals, as well as those of the stillborn, quote, Fourth International. Based on Marxist theory, the group adhered to the principle of working class self-determination through the establishment of workers' councils for the capture of political power and the transformation of the capitalist into a socialist system of production and distribution, end quote. Maddock. The attraction this group had for Korsch was obvious. It held to the positions he had already reached before going into exile, on the Jacobinist traits still present in Marxism and Leninism, and the rejection of, quote, Trotskyism along with, quote, Stalinism. I've examined these positions in a previous chapter, so there is no need to do so here. What I now propose to do is to examine his ideas on the main political question of the day, that of the rise of fascism and the outbreak of the Second World War. When Korsch was a member of the KPD, he held the orthodox Marxist view that the 20th century was the imperialist epoch of wars and revolutions. Now, by contrast, he inclined to a more pessimistic view, quote, more than any preceding period of recent history and on a much vaster scale, our period is a time not of revolution but of counter-revolution, end quote. This is a general position, by the way, especially if you just think of, like, I just read a book as a comparable to this in certain ways, about the life of Anton Pannekoek, his political life, he wrote Workers' Councils in 1944 about, like, the possible council system, in, like, very much in isolation, and then after the war he was very, like, pessimistic, had a very pessimistic attitude, and this is a general thing of, like, I think what's his name, Victor Serres has some quote of, like, the midnight of the 20th century or something like that. Anyway, this meant revising his views on the earlier period of his political activity. Thus, his attitude to the German revolutions of 1918 to 1919 changed radically. Quote, the workers' revolution was in reality nothing but an elementary explosion. It was a mere accident that this rebellion was experienced by its participants as an attempt at a socialist revolution, end quote. Korsch now thought that the workers' councils were, quote, a spontaneous experiment of the German workers in a new form of democracy. Looking backward, we may say that this was the very last chance for the survival of a genuine democratic self-government under conditions of a rapidly increasing monopoly and state capitalism in post-war Europe, end quote. Korsch also argued that the formation of the KPD was a mistake. When the USPD accepted the 21 conditions for joining the Comintern, it did not listen to the warnings of the, quote, left communists on the Liebknecht-Luxemburg tradition, who emphasized the spontaneity of rank-and-file mass action as against the supremacy of leadership from above. He even went further to argue that this leadership was acting on secret orders received from the, quote, often suspicious agents of unknown superiors, end quote. Returning to the present, the most obvious sign of the counter-revolutionary nature of the epoch was the rise of fascism. Korsch recognized, as he had perhaps been unwilling to recognize immediately after Hitler's seizure of power, a fact that many Marxists still refuse to face, that fascism had genuine popular support. Quote, although Nazism is neither socialist nor democratic, yet by feeding upon the failures and omissions of the so-called, quote, system politicians, end quote, Nazism enrolled in the long run the support of the majority of the nation, and in both the economic and political fields solved a number of concrete problems that had been neglected or frustrated by the unsocialist attitudes of the socialists and the undemocratic behavior of the Democrats. Korsch. Korsch's own view of fascism was that it was revolutionary in its political form, but evolutionary in its objective social content. The transition to a new type of capitalistic society that could no longer be achieved by the democratic and peaceful means of traditional socialism and trade unionism was performed by a counter-revolutionary and anti-proletarian, yet objectively progressive and ideologically anti-capitalistic and plebeian movement that had learned to apply to its restricted evolutionary aims the unrestricted methods developed during the preceding revolution. And this is a very interesting thing. It's very similar, I think, to some of particularly well, he's still calling it capitalist, but I think there's a lot of relevance to similarities to what's his name, Dwight McDonald's kind of attitude, like actually taking seriously the anti-capitalist content, or at least on the ideological level of Nazism and fascism, right? This is something that a lot of left-wing people today try to separate themselves from, or insist that it's strictly capitalist or something like that. That's I think that's important, and it's kind of like it's sort of like a brave thing to say, I'd say, in certain respects, to actually concede. I mean, maybe I'm not wrong, maybe it's not that brave, but it seems like to concede that there was actually some kind of anti-capitalist content to fascism seems very a brave theoretically thing to do. But of course, and I think Korsch would say this probably as well. Maybe not. Maybe he wouldn't say this, but especially if you think of the kind of like a group that was kind of active at the same time, analyzing similar world historical situation, made a point of distinguishing between socialism and anti-capitalism. Was the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League tendency, Shachtman, Carter, Draper, Jacobson, the Jacobsons, etc. Making a point that something being anti-capitalist, which does not mean it's progressive in some kind of automatic sense, because you can have something you can have a non-capitalist or anti-capitalist society that's entirely bereft of self-determination of human beings, especially the producers. Thus, there was a certain room for evolution in capitalist society. In a paradoxical way, this evolutionary process was being carried forward by the fascist counter-revolution. Quote, a certain part of the task that, quote, normally would have been fulfilled by a genuinely progressive and revolutionary movement were fulfilled in a distorted, but nevertheless realistic manner by the transitory victory of a non-socialist, undemocratic, but plebeian and anti-reactionary counter-revolution. Unquote. That's actually super interesting. That actually things like the anti-reactionary counter-revolution, right? Because that's one of the important things about fascism, is that it's there's a temptation always to kind of bracket in reactionary forces or or far right forces into kind of one camp, right? And obviously there's various degrees of collaboration and solidarity between far right groups, right? But it was not the intention of the Nazis to reestablish the Hohenzollern dynasty in Germany, but to really put the Germany onto a fundamentally new nationalist terrain, as opposed to a nationalist imperial terrain, as opposed to a monarchist imperial terrain, if that makes sense. Korsch emphasized that Nazi Germany was still a capitalist society, but of a new type. In its basic economic aspect, it appeared to represent a transition from the private and anarchic form of competitive capitalism, which was the rule in the 19th century, to a system of planned and organized monopoly capitalism or state capitalism. This was a historically necessary transition. It would be quite unmaterialistic and unscientific to expect that the historical progression from competitive capitalism to planned economy and even state capitalism could be repealed by any power in the world. Even America could not escape this development. Here he rather exaggerates to make his case. Quote, there is no essential difference between the way the New York Times and Nazi press publish daily, quote, all the news that's fit to print, end quote. There is no difference in principle between the 80-odd voices of capitalist mammoth corporations, which over the American radio recommend to legions of silent listeners the use of X-Lax, camels, and neighborhood groceries, along with music, war, baseball, and domestic news and dramatic sketches, and the one suave voice of Mr. Goebbels, who recommends armaments, race purity, and the worship of the Fuhrer. End quote. Korsch. While Korsch argues for the need for an economic analysis of fascism, the nearest he gets to this is contained in the arguments above. A more substantial analysis of the economy of fascist societies never emerges. Admittedly, this would be a very difficult task, and he is rightly critical of well-researched investigations into this. New and for a Marxist puzzling phenomenon, e.g. Franz Neumann's Behemoth. I think Franz Neumann's Behemoth has, to a large extent, stood the test of historical time. But I think it's still regarded as a very solid work. I have pieces about Franz Neumann and Behemoth on this channel. Anyway, Korsch still maintained that although Marxism could offer no political guide to action for the working class because of its basically faulty appreciation of politics, its economic analysis remains sound. Quote, there is no doubt today than at any former time in history that the Marxian analysis of the working of the capitalist mode of production and of its historical development is fundamentally correct. End quote. Korsch. It is interesting to note, in view of the conception of laws of society which he had put forward in the book Karl Marx, but which he had not given instances of, that he claims that his analysis explains the, quote, law of the fully developed counter-revolution of our time, end quote, which is, quote, after the complete exhaustion and defeat of the revolutionary forces, the fascist counter-revolution attempts to fulfill, by new revolutionary methods, and in widely different form, those social and political tasks which the so-called reformistic parties and trade unions had promised to achieve, but in which they could not succeed in the given historical conditions, end quote. Korsch. This counter-revolutionary character of the epoch was complemented by similar developments in the, quote, communist world. Thus, in political terms, there is little difference between the Soviet Union and the fascist states. In fact, quote, through the comprehensiveness of its anti-democratic and totalitarian development, is often anticipated the so-called fascist characteristics of the openly counter-revolutionary states of Europe and Asia. End quote. Korsch. And this is something that Trotsky says as well. This is this is a general idea. And the reason I'm saying that is that there's this conception, I think, put forward by certain revisionist historians with certain sympathies for the USSR and maybe even in fact for Stalinism, but that's a little more debatable, of throwing out the concept of totalitarianism as entirely as for ostensibly papers over the differences between fascism and Stalinism, which in the one sense it does, right? But comparing contrast and comparison are both important tools of analysis, and to just throw out any comparison, which is between any system or any society, is ridiculous. But especially there is definitely certain features that you could say were 100% similar in the USSR and in the fascist states. That's just 100% true, and especially so yeah, this general this general totalitarian analysis of the USSR and the Soviet Union is not something that's is not something by any means that's like exclusive to just like rabid cold warriors, right? It's people who very much like put in tremendous work and have had a tremendous experience theoretically and in often case in the terms of like struggle, right, in the um, revolutionary left. Just that's why I'm pointing it out. That like saying, just pointing that out that this type of law, this type of thinking, is not some kind of um, display of conservatism or something like that on Korsch's part. What Korsch was referring to was the fact that in internal Russian politics, the punishments given for the smallest deviation from the prescribed patterns of opinion exceeded in violence even the measures used in fascist countries. Russia is also fully involved externally in quote imperialist politics, the game of power politics using international alliances. And again, this is something that you find like in the best like the critics of Trotskyism. I've done a lot of research, and there's a lot of things on this channel about the Trotskyist movement in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s on the Russian question. In particular, one of the main things that like the Shachtman organization says is that when talking and like their especially in like even before that, it's like a defined like the Workers' Party comes into existence. Like while Trotsky's still alive, like one of the main the most explosive debates at the time were fundamentally about whether about what was the content of support for the Soviet Union, right? The unconditional support which Trotsky insisted on. On the one hand, they all were like very eager to condemn the westward expansion of the USSR in collaboration with the Nazi Germany, but once that was done, they supported it wholeheartedly and viewed it as like a progressive step for humanity. And the contradictions of that whole like paradigm were pointed out by people within the movement itself. And one of the main things they said is that like not only like there's this kind of characterization of it like of the Nazi-Soviet pact being just a mere like non-aggression pact or something like that, but in fact it was like an imperial alliance for the carving up of Eastern Europe was basically their position. So this is a kind of like this kind of thing, of course, is like a very this is more pretty general. Anyway, Korsch's explanation of this similarity depends on the estimation of Marxism itself, which he had arrived at as early as 1930. Here he draws the consequences of this position for the analysis of the Soviet Union. Quote, if the political concepts of Marxism were derived from the great tradition of the bourgeois revolution, if the umbilical cord between Marxism and Jacobinism was never cut, it seems less paradoxical that the revolutionary Marxist state, in its present development, should reflect that great historical process of decay, by which today the leading sections of the bourgeoisie in every country of Europe abandon their previous political ideals. Korsch. At the outbreak of the war, then, Korsch was given the nature of his analysis, understandably very pessimistic about the outcome. Quote, in the present war, the victory of either party will result in a further gigantic step towards the fascistization of Europe, if not of the whole European, American, Asiatic world of tomorrow. Quote. Korsch. Given that this was the likely outcome, could the working class adopt any political position which would lead it in the direction of socialism? Korsch argued that none of the revolutionary slogans of the First World War could be immediately applied to the present situation, because, quote, there is no longer a need for the revolutionary workers of 1941 to bring out by their own consistent effort that, quote, transformation of the capitalist war into a civil war, end quote. Thus describes the ultimate aim of the working class by the most daring revolutionary slogan of 1914. That's Lenin's slogan. The present war, from its very outset, has been a veritable civil war on both a European and worldwide scale. End quote. The reason for this is that the bourgeoisie in all the, quote, democratic countries was itself divided into pro and anti-Hitler factions, unlike the unity of the ruling class which had prevailed during the earlier war. Under such conditions, the slogan, down with the, quote, imperialist war, fitted in too perfectly with the tendencies of the bourgeois appeasers and isolationists. That's very fucking interesting right there. Under such conditions, the slogan, quote, "Down with the imperialist war," unquote, fitted in too perfectly with the tendencies of the bourgeois appeasers and isolationists, right? That's a very it's a very interesting thing, interesting idea. The reason it's interesting is that because like the impulse of the left is always to say down with the imperialist war, and as if that's their kind of like just obvious a priori mandate. Um, um, right, and this is like a kind of like, and it kind of like points to like a lot of what Korsch is saying here is that like it seems like he's recognizing to some extent that these wars are different wars and have like a different content, and the involvement of fascism in this war is of extreme significance in a way that it was not, which a way that radically changed its character uh, in the 19 um, which radically changed the character of the Second World War. There's some piece that I wanted to find. For some reason, I thought it was. I can't remember who wrote it. It's like, but it's very funny. I think it's from people kind of from like the radical critical theory milieu, like anti-German milieu in um, Germany. Um, had some kind of thing where it's kind of like a snarky like list characterizing different left-wing tendencies, and one of the things they said for the Bordigas was that there's no distinction. they thought that the Second World War was the same as the First World War, which it like wasn't. So it's a matter of indifference whether the United States and the Soviet Union win or if Nazi Germany wins. It's all the same. Which they obviously criticize. And I think that kind of like, there was people that wanted to like, there was people who were very, eager to go to war, I suppose it seems like, and then there was like in like the mainstream like bourgeois like state apparatus or whatever the hell you want to call it, they were very eager to go to war. People who were more isolationists. Um, um, yeah, so I don't know where I'm going with that. I'll just keep reading. Sorry. Under such conditions, the slogan, quote, "Down with imperialist war," fitted too perfectly with the tendencies of the bourgeois appeasers and isolationists. The same applied to the slogan, quote, "Defeat one's own country," unquote, which is a practical policy to which substantial sections of the ruling class in several European countries subscribed because they prefer the victory of fascism to the loss of their supremacy. After criticizing the conduct of, quote, "democratic nations such as Great Britain and the USA," Korsch puts forward his view of the policy necessary for the working class if it is to defeat Hitler and fascism. This is to be achieved by, quote, "the independent fight of the working class for its most elementary and most narrowly defined, most concrete class aims. Not Great Britain, not, quote, democracy, but the proletarian class is the world champion in the revolutionary fight of humanity against the scourge of fascism." That's very similar to third campus position, and it's like a third, and it's like a seems kind of like a prominent thing today. So it's always like the working class is like this is always ostensibly on its feet to do whatever the left wants it to do, and is always on the cusp of like doing what it wants to do, doing like throwing at fascism or overthrowing fascism or overthrowing socialism. Or establishing socialism or something like that. Which seems kind of in distinction to his more pessimistic line. And not that the independent fight of the working class, elementary, most narrowly defined, most concrete class aims, as Korsch does here, is a bad thing, but I think it's very kind of like dubious to think that like, oh yeah, like the working class is going to overthrow Nazism in Germany, as if some kind of like, as if what stopped fascism weren't like massive armies. Right? as much as horrifying as massive armies are, and as far and the societies behind them being unacceptable by a socialist standard, it seems to me like, I mean, that is what fundamentally defeated fascism, was like the Red Army and the United States, at least in the European theater. That was kind of like the big thing. Um, and people always want to, not that partisans or anything like that or resistance fighters didn't matter, or like people who were like um, any of those things, nor does that mean they were not extremely heroic and brave people. But I don't think that just like it seems to me like, like there's this idea almost that like the partisan guerrillas on their own would have defeated fascism. um, you know that seems dubious to me, even though obviously partisans played a huge role. I mean, in, at least on a local level, of dislodging fascists, right? Um, but it seems like their successes were kind of dependent on this larger context, um, of 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 the powers of the Red Army, Stalin's Red Army, and the forces of the armies of Western imperialism, right? They kind of, um, you know, if they weren't so severely weakened, they might have had a greater chance of taking back territories lost to the partisans. Um, right? Would Yugoslavia have been able to remain? Would there have been a independent? Would Tito's Yugoslavia have survived without the Soviet Union and the United States defeating uh, the Nazis? Right? Would that have been possible? Would have like the overthrow of fascism in Italy actually been sustainable if like the fascist with Nazi and fascist forces weren't castrated by larger powers? I don't know. That's just something I think about. I don't really have a great answer to, but like there's almost like this like thing that's like the working class will just overthrow its whole thing. And right now it's relevant, right? Because a lot of the things you hear in like in the press right now, or like in the not in the press, but in like the left wing circles about this, particularly about this war in Iran, um, is like this kind of idea that they like don't want to support uh, the Islamic Republic, or at least like decent leftists don't want to support the Islamic Republic, and do think it should be overthrown, and do think it's as repressive as it actually is. But they kind of say, well, it should be overthrown by the people of Iran themselves, which is good and not impossible. However, uh, when there has been mass protest, they've been very, very brutally put down. Um, and how many generations of people are just going to keep getting mowed down by this regime whenever they try to overthrow it? Um, you know, how long is that going to go on? So there's like a degree to which I don't know, just I don't really know how to like piece it together. But for me, there always seems like there's this thing of like, yeah, the war in Ukraine is going to be ended by the Russian working class and the Ukrainian working class coming together to overthrow their respective governments and turn this so-called inter-imperialist war into a civil war, which just seems so kind of just like you're just like kind of like putting your well wishes onto the world, when in fact like the kind of direct um whereas the kind of like the revolutions that you're hoping for is just like not, or like the things that you're hoping for are just not there. You know what I'm saying? I don't know if that makes sense at all. Um, but yeah, this is kind of just an idea. This is like, I don't know, like people power or something like that is gonna, you know, is gonna overthrow a government, as if without that government being kind of forced into some kind of like external pressure, from whatever circumstances, right? Um, Yeah. So, sorry, I'm going to repeat what I said. This is to be achieved by, quote, the independent fight of the working class for its most elementary, most narrowly defined, most concrete class aims. Not Great Britain, not, quote, democracy, but the proletarian class is the world champion in the revolutionary fight of humanity against the scourge of fascism, end quote. Korsch. This is hardly a very specific political directive to the working class. Indeed, it seems questionable whether it would lead to a political action in the traditional revolutionary sense at all. A fight for the, quote, most narrowly defined, most concrete class aims, end quote, would seem to indicate the trade union struggle is the area in which the working class must concentrate its efforts. This perhaps reflects the narrowing opportunities, never very great, for revolutionary politics in the United States. From this point onwards, 1941, Korsch's political activity declined considerably. Korsch's main contribution had been to the journal Living Marxism, but in the autumn of 1942, in the face of increasing reaction, it was obliged to change its name to the more neutral New Essays, a quarterly devoted to the study of modern society, and a year later it had ceased publication entirely. During the war, Korsch's main activity, which had a political bent, was his work in connection with military training programs, which he assisted by giving lectures on German politics. Which is, again, a common thing for these expats, right? So, for instance, Neumann, or no, what's his name? Pollock, maybe Neumann as well. I can't remember, but like Marcuse, right? They worked for the Office of Secret Services, the OSS, which I think is like to my understanding, is like the proto CIA, right? In the fight against fascism. So this is this isn't like this is pretty common. While he is a regular contributor to the journal Living Marxism, Korsch's work had focused fairly consistently on the political problems of the day, especially fascism. Now that he no longer had such a focus for his work, it began to grow more diffuse in direction. I shall now examine the various lines of thought which he started but was unable to finish. In March 1945, his old friend and collaborator Bertolt Brecht wrote to him about his proposed verification of the Communist Manifesto. Brecht asked Korsch to loan him a copy of Kehrpunkte der materialistischen Geschichte-Auffassung so that he might remain on the right lines theoretically. In his reply, Korsch seemed more intent on telling his friend about a lecture he had been invited to give on the economic and social structure of the Soviet Union to the faculty of the State University of Louisiana, Baton Rouge, only adding incidentally, quote, your 380 sheets are a masterwork, end quote. During this period, Korsch's published writings on more abstract questions virtually ceased, with the exception of a review of Vernon Venable's book, Human Nature, the Marxian View. It has already been noted in connection with his work with Lewin on field theory that he is prepared to go much further in the direction of positivism than he was at the time of writing the book Karl Marx, as the following passage shows, quote, the historical and sociological approach of Marx and Engels to the phenomena of knowledge has resulted in the accumulation of a vast and as yet, Pace, Scheller, and Mannheim, almost entirely untapped reservoir of pregnant thought that is only waiting for its complete disentanglement from the residues of a now obsolete philosophical language. The first vigorous steps in this direction were already taken by Marx himself, and in a less penetrating manner by Engels. Yet this important development was not continued by Marxist scholars of the two subsequent generations. They either ignored and forgot these problems or, if they were aware of them, tended to reverse the whole process of reading Hegelian philosophy back into the scientific and pragmatic theory of Marx, end quote, Korsch. At the same time, however, Korsch maintained that the early philosophical phase of Marx's writing could not be simply set aside as merely a, quote, idealist prelude, end quote, to their later materialist and socialist theories, quote. It is not possible to dissect the development of the Marxian thought into two entirely independent phases. The manifold forms in which the philosophical language of the earlier phase still survives in the later development of the theoretical and practical activities of Marx and Engels must be considered in any attempt at the interpretation of the Marxian theory. End quote. Korsch. Clearly, a book review was an inadequate place for explaining his new views, but unfortunately, Korsch never did succeed in doing this at any greater length. For a time, Korsch toyed with the idea of rewriting the book Karl Marx. In September 1947, he went to Mexico to visit Brecht. There he was shown a German text of his book. Although he made a substantial number of corrections, it is difficult to read into these any change of ideological position. Anyway, in 1947, Brecht took a copy with him to Europe in order to find a publisher for the new version. In April 1948, he reported to Korsch that he had been unsuccessful. By this time, in any case, Korsch's interest had changed, and he had decided that he did not want to have it published. He had now become interested in something quite different, in the developments in colonial countries, the liberation movements which began at the end of the Second World War. Korsch's interest in this area of the world was first signaled by his article titled "The World Historians, from Turgot to Toynbee," published in 1942, in which he pointed out, quote, how illusory were the dreams of the classical philosophers and historians of the bourgeois epoch, who imagined that in some way they were dealing with the universe, when all the time they dealt with an exceedingly small sector of that universe, end quote. Korsch. Korsch's interest in this question grew after the war. In the European countries, there were immense social conflicts. Germany, in particular, saw the reemergence of factory councils, Betriebsräte, and their eventual absorption under the system of Mitbestimmung, co-determination. However, unfortunate was that Korsch, with his immense wealth of experience from the early 1920s, did not comment on this. Instead, from as early as 1946, he showed greater attention to the colonial situation. In his article titled "Independence Comes to the Philippines," he shows how the Western domination of the colonies has to assume new forms. Independence was now recognized as inevitable, and the Western powers were concerned about how to make the colonies, quote, mature enough for independence. Korsch warns, however, that this independence, quote, will be used as a further link in the chain of economic oppression and exploitation. So it appears that the struggle for and against independence and the various positions which different groups and interests adopt in this struggle at the moment, in fact, have a radically altered significance, end quote. Korsch. The old-style colonial politics of Western imperialism were made obsolete by the Great Depression of the 1930s and by the rise of Japan, Hitler, and Mussolini. The new style of imperialist politics, to be seen in the countermeasures of the expansionist Western countries against the independence movements which arose both during and after the war, had its roots in determinate political and cultural developments. Korsch recommends a concrete materialist investigation of this new imperialism, but only gives one result of his studies. Quote, here. Quote, the new form of imperialism depends more than all of the previous varieties on, quote, friendly governments, puppets, quislings, and all possible kinds of collaborators, including certain kinds of so-called resistance movements, end quote. Korsch. The remaining fragmentary drafts Korsch wrote on this question in the following 8 years testify to his continuing interest, but do not allow an evaluation of any position much more advanced than the one reached in the article above. It was perhaps the failure of the working class movement in the West which gave an impetus to the article 10 Theses on Marxism Today, the final summary of Korsch's position in these years. Before reviewing that work, I would like to mention briefly the events of Korsch's final years. It has not been possible to discover very much about the last years before his mental collapse in 1957. One interesting connection one would have liked to know more about is that with Roman Rozdalsky. In 1952 and 1953, Korsch worked with the latter on Marx's Grundrisse. This was hardly known at the time, as there were only 3 or 4 copies in the West before the appearance of the 1953 Berlin edition. Rozdalsky later completed a brilliant analysis of the Grundrisse, but unfortunately we do not know if Korsch played any part in this. The rest of this period is the familiar story of the later years of unfulfilled projects. The most important of these apparently is the Buch der Abschaffungen, a rewriting of the book Karl Marx, which has not yet been made available. In 1957, after a period of poor health, Korsch had a final breakdown and was not able to work again before his death. The 10 Theses on Marxism Today were the basis of a lecture Korsch gave on his journey to Europe in 1950, among other places at Zurich. In view of the fact that they were unpublished and fragmentary, I think it would be unwise to place too much reliance on them. They're not in any case significantly new in terms of the ideas they state. it would be quite erroneous to hold that they mark Korsch's first break with Marxism. For example, his view that Marxism accepts the political forms of the bourgeois revolution, the notion that Leninism is the form in which Marxism is applied to Russia and Asia, the need for workers' direct determination of production, are, as earlier chapters have shown, all ideas which he had begun to formulate in the late 1920s and to expound at greater length in the 1930s. What is most striking here is the sharpness with which Marxism is generally attacked. Here I'd like to put it at some length, as it is this feature which is novel in the theses. Quote, 1. It no longer makes sense to ask what extent the teaching of Marx and Engels is today theoretically acceptable and practically applicable. 2. Today, all attempts to reestablish the Marxist doctrine as a whole in its original function as a theory of the social revolution of the working class are reactionary utopia. There's very much a position, there seems to be an overlap in that position between Korsch and Castoriadis, for instance. The later Socialisation of Barbarie, which held on to like a revolutionary direct democratic or like self-management conception of socialism, but disagreed with like Marxism as kind of like an all-encompassing theory of the world. So that's kind of, it seems like some of that last sentence. Today, all attempts to reestablish the Marxist doctrine as a whole in its original function as a theory of the social revolution of the working class are a reactionary utopia. That sounds like that could come out of Socialisation and Barbarie. 4. The first step in reestablishing a revolutionary theory and practice consists in breaking with that Marxism which claims to monopolize revolutionary initiative as well as theoretical and practical direction. Unquote. Again, could have come straight from Socialisation and Barbarie, like especially Castoriadis in the 1960s. Admittedly, this is qualified by the third thesis, quote, 3. Though basically ambiguous, there are, however, important aspects of Marxian teaching which in their changing function and applying to different locations have until today retained their effectiveness. Unquote. Such a decisive rejection would seem to call for a new content to Korsch's criticism of Marx, but this is not indicated at all here, as all his objections have been voiced previously. He now situates Marx as, quote, one among the numerous precursors, founders, and developers of the socialist movement of the working class, unquote, Korsch. Of equal importance with Marx are the utopian socialists from Thomas More to the present day, Marx's great competitors, Blanqui, Proudhon, and Bakunin, and also the further development of Marxism by German revisionism, French syndicalism, and Russian Bolshevism. 10 Theses, and this is like a new section. 10 Theses is Korsch's last published comment on Marxism. Whereas he himself thought that he had gone beyond Marxism, in my view, he had returned to a political position very similar to the one he held in his pre-Marxist days. His acceptance of the quote, correctness of Marx's economic analyses while rejecting the validity of Marx's concept of politics led him to an essentially eclectic position in which the syndicalist and quote, spontaneous elements predominated. Let's look more closely at the features of his thought which remained constant throughout his changes of political allegiance. What remained consistent throughout his active political life was the stress on practice. In his pre-Marxist phase, Korsch had thought that the active will necessary for social change should act at the level of psychology rather than at that of politics. His position in this period is admirably expressed by Rusconi. Quote, direct action is considered by Korsch primarily as an expression and stimulus of moral and psychological energies indispensable for the creation of a socialist economy. It is a pedagogic, not a political operation. In these direct actions, we are still a long way from specifying what subjects and what political forms will push the revolution forward, end quote. Rusconi. In his, quote, Leninist period as a leading member of the Communist Party of Germany, Korsch seemed to have specified the subjects, the Revolutionary Party and its subordinate organizations, and the political forms, the Revolutionary Workers' Councils, which would push the revolution forward. The two major works of this period are the book Labor Law for Factory Councils and the book Marxism and Philosophy, in which he attempted to apply the theory of Marx and Lenin as he understood it to the problems of law and ideology. I add the qualification, quote, as he understood it, end quote, because it is important to realize that Korsch's understanding of Lenin in particular was seriously at fault. His own conviction that ideology must express the conditions of the existing class struggle is shown to be quite erroneous. During this period, Korsch was associated with the broadest revolutionary working class movement yet seen in Europe, but in itself this did not confer correctness on either his or the KPD's theories. Although contact with such a movement gave his work an immediacy and coherence which it often otherwise lacked, Korsch's stress on practice and his failure to understand the nature of ideological struggle persisted despite his undoubtedly sincere adherence to Leninism. Thus he has shown that both the pamphlet, or the book, Labor Law for Factory Councils, and the book Marxism and Philosophy aim to apply Lenin's ideas to contemporary problems facing the revolutionary movement, and that both embodied fundamental errors. The former showed a misunderstanding of Lenin's conception of imperialism as a transitional epoch. It argued that the notion could be applied not only to changes in the economic structure of society, but also to its ideological features. In the latter, Korsch argued just as Lenin had, quote, restored Marx's teaching on the state and applied it creatively, he himself would carry out a similar restoration of Marx's ideas on philosophy. Yet, unlike Lenin's work, the end result is rather insubstantial. It provides neither a concrete analysis of specific ideologies nor definite political perspectives based on this analysis. During such a period, the stress on, quote, practice at least meets a response in the situation and activity of the working class. But Korsch applied Lenin's idea that the present imperialist epoch was one of, quote, wars and revolutions, end quote, rather too literally. Trotsky also accepted Lenin's conception, introduced the necessary qualification, quote, a recognition of the fact that the war in October opened an epoch of world revolution does not mean, of course, that at every given moment we have on hand an immediately revolutionary situation, The fall of world revolution, the epoch of world revolution will have its periods of rise and fall, end quote, Trotsky. This raises the question which Korsch was soon to face. After the defeat of the German Revolution in October 1923, what is to happen in non-revolutionary situations? If Marxism is merely the expression of the general conditions of the actually existing class struggle, does it become non-revolutionary when the working class turns away from the revolutionary struggle? Korsch's argument is then open to the following objection. For him, Marxism as a theory of revolution derives its truth value not from its representation of total social practice, nor from the interest of the proletariat within the total system of capitalist society, but from the contingent turns of the organized class struggle. The historical verification of the Marxism theory is then reduced to the immediacy of its contingent practical success. Thus, Marxist theory loses its necessary character. It also loses its anticipatory character. Korsch's reconstruction of the development of Marxism does not give sufficient weight to the anticipatory content of Marxism, which occurs thanks to its scientific analysis of society, and which enables it to foresee the conditions under which the class struggle will take place, and thus anticipate the forms of the emergence of class positions, instead of simply reflecting them after they have formed. When Korsch applied his criterion of practice consistently outside of Marxian movement, it led him to reject Lenin and finally Marx as a political guide. This did not become immediately apparent after his expulsion from the KPD. His first major work after this point was his critique of Kautsky's book, The Materialist Conception of History. Korsch's main objection to Kautsky was that, quote, his conception of history is, a purely, quote, purely scientific theory, end quote, which can only be considered, quote, proletarian, insofar as today it is a matter of fact recognized only in the circles of the proletariat and its intellectual representatives, end quote. Korsch. For the most part, this work contains nothing which could not have found a place in the book Marxism and Philosophy, but it contains an anticipation of Korsch's criticism of Leninism, which was to be more fully elaborated in the anti-critique to the book Marxism and Philosophy. There, Korsch made a distinction between, quote, theory, that is the expression of the conditions of the actually existing class struggle, and, quote, ideology, which he applied to Lenin's concept of the party and revolution. It came to the conclusion that Lenin's famous proposition about class consciousness being brought to the working class from the outside by socialist intellectuals indicated that, quote, Leninism, like, quote, Kautskism, was an ideology. It served a different purpose, the development of capitalism, then state capitalism in Russia, but it was an ideology nonetheless. Given this view of Marxist theory, there's a certain logic in Korsch's progression from seeing Leninism as an ideological distortion of Marxist theory to seeing Marxism itself as an ideology. Quote, Marx, from the first to the last, defined his concept of class in ultimately political terms, and in fact, though not in words, subordinated the multiple activities exerted by the masses in their daily class struggle to the activities exerted on their behalf by their political leaders. Korsch. Yet this did not mean a total rejection of Marxism, as was made clear in Korsch's last major work titled Karl Marx. His view of Marxism is that it does not need any philosophical supports. Indeed, is anti-philosophical. He lays much greater emphasis than in any previous work on the scientific character of Marxism. Quote, Marx's new socialist and proletarian science, which, in a changed historical situation, further developed the revolutionary theory of the classical founders of the doctrine of society, is the genuine social science of our time. End quote. Korsch. Yet in no sense does Korsch argue that Marxism has no practical thrust. For instance, his concluding chapters states that, quote, Marx defined all social phenomena historically, and indeed is a revolutionary process, which results from the development of the material forces of production and is realized by the struggle of the social classes, end quote. Korsch. Thus, in Karl Marx, we find an uneasy coexistence between a, quote, practical conception of the class struggle, to which Marxism has made great contributions, and a, quote, theoretical conception colored by positivism of Marxism as a social science. The non-revolutionary period, which began in the mid-1920s, was to continue for the rest of Korsch's life. He himself summed up the dilemma of the revolutionary activist in a non-revolutionary period in an article written in 1946. Quote, it is useless to discuss the controversial aspects of a theory of society, ... when such a discussion does not form part of a real social struggle. There must be various possibilities of action for the party, group, or class, which the theory in question can relate to, end quote. Korsch. The positive side of Korsch's Marxism, which makes it superior to most varieties of, quote, Western Marxism, is that it attempted to place Marxism in the service of the revolutionary working class movement. Its weakness was that because it failed to realize the importance of theoretical preparation for the resurgence of such a movement and the necessity for a Leninist party to lead such a movement, if it was to be victorious, it was condemned to passivity even at the height of the revolutionary movement, as Korsch's own experience in the German Revolution showed. The last word must be left to Lenin, quote, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement, end quote. And that's from What Is to Be Done, right? And that's the end of chapter 8. Chapter 8 of Karl Korsch, A Study in Western Marxism by Patrick Goode. Chapter 8 was titled Beyond Marxism. It's such a dumb way to end a thing. It's like, oh, he was bad. It was like he wasn't a Leninist, so he was wrong. It kind of seems like the whole thesis of the book is like he's not a Leninist. Not that there isn't interesting things and interesting dynamics pointed out in the book, but it's just like, oh, he's not this other guy, so he's incorrect. I don't know, maybe that's a dumb way of putting it on my part, but it kind of seems like that's the idea here. He stopped believing in the Vanguard Party, therefore he's an idiot. Basically, that's too dumb. There's a lot of sophistication in some of these arguments, but that kind of seems like the simplified version of what's being said here is basically, Korsch stopped being a Leninist, so he was he didn't have anything to say, or like not or like he wasn't. He was like just all his whole his whole theoretical frame was off because he wasn't a Leninist. The other thing that I think is like also like a fundamental weakness of this book, in my opinion, was like really kind of talking about, which is such an important part of his whole critique of Leninism, was kind of like being influenced under the influence of this whole other thing of like the council communist world, There wasn't really any talk about council communism at all. I'd really like to hear actually. I wish there was a publication in English of one of Michael Buckmiller's books about Korsch, because I feel like that would actually. I would be curious to hear a more sympathetic reading of him. But thank you so much for listening.